Good morning, drummers. Garey Williams is back today to talk with you about tuning. So before I jump into all the things I'm going to share with you about it, because this is actually quite a long journey and an involved process, just want to let you know that I've been playing now for it's my 45th year playing the drums, and I've been teaching actually for 37 years. I have an endorsement by Ludwig Drums, Peisty Cymbals, Remo drum heads, innovative percussion sticks. Then I also endorse some cases, sim pads, and some other stuff. So I'm giving you this little bit of credibility to what I'm about to share with you for my journey when it came to realizing all the things about tuning. So my first experience with drumming started in 6th grade band, where I played snare drum and bass drum. And I rented a snare from a local music store. And I started experimenting with my drum key one day because I didn't really know much about tuning. I just got started. I didn't like the sound of the snare drum very well, so I started cranking the head. And it started sounding much better. So I kept cranking it to the point where the whole thing just split and tore. So after that, I replaced the head, of course, but then I was a little shy to crank up the drum because I thought, I might just break another head. So probably took me a while to experiment with tightening up my snare. But I just played snare drum only. So that was my only experience. And then after my 6th grade year, I got a drum set, red sparkle kit back in the days. This was in the 70s. And then I started playing the drum set right before 12th grade. And during this process, I had the same kind of cheap red sparkle kit. I don't even know what it was. It didn't have a logo on it. It was sort of an import kit, probably a Montgomery Ward special. It was a 4-piece kit. And I tried all kinds of heads over the next 6 years of playing that drum set. I talked about my rudiments in the last video, and I did all my rudimental stuff. And this was the drum set that I played in my rock bands, and actually got so good that I entered a drum set competition as a senior in high school, put on by the Percussive Art Society, and was selected as the high school division winner by Louis Belson, who at the time was playing Slingerland drums. And my drum teacher played Slingerland drums, and they were really popular at that time. So by the time I graduated with high school, I bought a professional level kit to my satisfaction, which was a Slingerland drum set, pretty much modeled after Louis Belson. It had a big 24-inch bass drum, a 13-inch mounted tom, 16 and 18-inch floor toms, kind of a brown plastic wrap finish. And that was a whole different animal. I went from these cheap kind of mahogany blended shells with really kind of not very clean edges to a drum that was made better. It was maple sort of composite shell with somewhat sharper edges. And I played that drum set for 4 years, and I tried all kinds of heads. I can remember really being frustrated with a lot of the ring my drums had. The overtones were really bugging me because when I listened to recordings, the drums just had this really lush, fat, rich sound, especially the toms. Well, really, for that matter, all the drums sounded processed because they were recorded, and there was lots of things done to their sound in the studio to help them sound as good as they do. So I remember one particular gig where I was trying to tune my drums and get them to sound really clear in terms of a nice even tone. And we ran out of time, and we were recording the gig, and the drums were just way too ringy, I thought. But then when I listened to the playback, they sounded really good. So that was one of my first experiences, realizing that a ringing drum isn't a bad drum as long as the ring has a fairly pure tone. And during this time with this rock band, I actually managed to take drum lessons with Mike DeRozier, the drummer for Heart. And this was during the period of time when Heart was probably at their biggest. And I actually took my drum set to his house and asked him to tune it for me. And I was really complaining about the overtones, and he was trying to convince me that, no, that's part of the sound. So it was kind of a weird process. I still wasn't convinced because starting at that point, I began listening to a lot of Steve Gadd, and he was a Yamaha drum player. And so eventually, after 4 years of this big Slingerland kit, I upgraded seriously to a Yamaha Recording Custom Series drum set. This kit was way more accurately made at the time. And so whenever I played something, I could hear every little snip and pop that wasn't in time. And I got into trying different heads, like Steve Gadd was using the Evans hydraulic head. So I began exploring those. And again, I didn't really have any particular ideas on how to tune other than making sure the head was in tune with itself. And what I mean by that is you tap around each of the tension rods, maybe an inch or two from the edge, not very heavily because you want to kind of hear the overtones like a guitarist might tune a guitar and using harmonics to purify the actual pitch of the note. So by doing that, I could get the head in tune with itself, but I didn't know how high or low to tune the head. And should the bottom head be the same? Should it be higher? Should it be lower? It was just really a problem. So it's a lot of practice. So after I played some Yamaha drums for about 6 years, I went through college, and then I got into a custom drum named Pork Pie Percussion. And some of you are probably familiar with that company now, but I started endorsing those Drumset drums in about 1989. That was actually my first drum endorsement. And I was able to call Bill Denimore, who was the brainchild. He started the company in his garage before it expanded and became as big as it is now. And so he started introducing me to all these things about drum construction that would affect their sound. The biggest one was the RIMS mounting system. RIMS stands for Resonant Isolation Mounting System. And this is where you take the bracket that's normally bolted to the tom shell, which is the standard operating procedure with student model drum sets, and then instead bolt it to a mount that allowed the ring around the drum, the RIMS mount, to suspend the drum using like these little rubber grommets, and the tension rods would go through it. So the drum would literally rest on this RIMS type of mounting system and not be held stiff. If you can imagine taking an acoustic guitar, which is usually held by a strap, and bolting it to a hard stand, it probably wouldn't resonate inside that acoustical chamber. And so with the releasing of the bracket to the shell, the drum could be tuned higher and lower and not really be affected by the mount itself. So that started to get my drum tuning a little bit better. And I explored all kinds of heads. I mostly play Remo heads. I endorse Remo heads. I did a period of time where I played Evans heads for a year, but they didn't really sound right to my ear. And I think it goes back to the kind of drum heads that I grew up hearing drummers play, which were primarily Remo heads. And that's why I use Ludwig drums, is because my favorite drummers played the Ludwig drums. That's why I also use Paiste cymbals, is because my favorite drummers played Paiste cymbals back in the day. Though I've played Zildjian and I endorsed Sabian cymbals for quite a number of years, I realized the sound in my head was a Paiste cymbal sound. So I went back to that. So getting back to the drum sound, there is actually so many different ways you can tune the drum. I'm going to start with the bass drum. I worked at the hardware store when I was in high school, and when I did this drum set competition where Louis Bilson selected me as the winner, he actually commented on how much he liked my bass drum sound, which was kind of cool. I think at the time I was experimenting with 2 front full heads. There was no hole in the front head, and I was trying shredded newspaper because they had that in packing boxes. I even tried styrofoam peanuts for a while, but they kind of rattled. Mike DeRozier, when I took lessons, showed me this method he used with a piece of foam touching both heads. But the drum was definitely fairly resonant. So the point being is that you got overtones, but you don't really hear that continuous ring when you blend it with the rest of the band. Now, this is another big part about tuning, is that when you're listening to the sound of a drum set on a recording, it's been highly processed. And so I'm going to share with you another really interesting story. So after Pork Pie, I left that drum company and I began endorsing Yamaha drums, went back to Yamaha. I had a drum set that was exactly like Dave Weckls, because I was a huge Dave Weckl fan. And he actually came to Seattle, Washington to do his first clinic. And the music store that sponsored his clinic was called American Music. They ordered his drum set from Japan, but they were concerned that his drum sizes and finish would maybe not arrive in time for the clinic. So they asked if he could use my drum set, which was kind of the exact same kit as his. And I said, sure. So it turned out that the clinic came, his drum set didn't arrive. So they called me and I was like, sure. So I went down and set it up, very nervous to meet him. But what was so radical about this is that at this time I was hearing his sound, and I got into the studio process sound by listening to a lot of Steve Gadd's recordings and his sound, and Weckl was kind of modeling it a bit more after that. But at this time I had 2-ply heads, and I had like this little insulation foam around the edge to really kind of cut out the overtones. So when I had the drum set set up, he started ripping off these insulation pieces, tuning the drums up. I was shocked because they were so much ringier and liver than the sound I remember hearing him play. The big lesson was that he talked about using gates and all kinds of studio processing equipment to produce his drum sound. But going into the microphone, the drum was very live and very round and very ringy. So there's lots of things that can affect the way a drum sounds. First of all, the shell material, because I played beechwood drums, birchwood drums, maple drums, mahogany drums, all kinds of metal snare drums. A big factor for me is the rims. So if the rims are made of what's called a triple flange tube, which is a thinner piece of metal, and it's usually a long piece of metal that's been bent and welded. Then there's what I call cast tubes or die cast, and that's literally a metal poured into a cast. Those rims are thicker and stiffer, and the pitch, if you were to hold them up and like actually hit them with a nail or triangle beater, would have a higher, less resonant tone in some respects, where a triple flange tube would have a lower, and it's a softer feel when you do rim shots. So I just started discovering that the sound of my snare drum was affected by what hoop I put on it. So going from a die cast to a triple flange tube gave me a more resonant tone, which I liked. I'm a big fan of rim shots, so that's a part of why I choose the triple flange tube. The thickness of the shell can have a big impact. The thicker the shell, the higher the actual resonating note of the piece of wood. So you can tune the drum higher. You can actually tune the drum any way you want. In fact, there's three main ways to tune a drum. First way is top and bottom heads are the same. Then there's kind of a live tuning where the top head is tighter and the bottom head slightly lower, half step, maybe a step. Then there's a studio tuning process where the top head is looser and the bottom head is tighter. And this is actually the tuning system that John Bonham would use on his drums for all you rock fans out there. When I moved, I actually endorsed DW drums for a while, and I went through this whole timbre tuning process where he stamps a note on the inside of the shell and tried to tune the drum head to the shell. But I realized that didn't really work for me in terms of the sound I was hearing in my head. Conceptually, it made sense when I thought about it, but often I discovered over my years of experimentation, and I'm really into this. I've had actually about 35 drum sets in my playing career, and I may have another one in a couple of years. I'm constantly an eternal student, learning, listening, developing my ears. So my ears get sharper, my taste buds change, I'm evolving. So naturally, I'm going to move to something that keeps up with where I'm hearing things. So when I play live with my jazz kit, which is on that side of the drum set, I use more of a live tuning where the bottom head's slightly lower. It gets the sound out there a bit more. But with my fusion kit, which is kind of off to the other side, I use the higher tuning. Now, when I got into playing back into Ludwig drums, when I was in this rock band, I was really trying to get the sound that Bonham had. And I had to understand that it had to do with shell ingredients. So I studied this video of Trust Your Ears by Jeff Ochiltree, and he plays the bottom heads of one of John Bonham's most recorded kits, which was a maple kit. He played the Vistalite clear amber drum sets live, but didn't like their sound in the studio. So he always went back to maple, but it wasn't a solid maple. This was the thing I had to discover with the Ludwig shell that gave it a distinctive sound, is the ingredients of the wood and the way the shell is constructed. So the early Ludwig shells were made of mahogany and poplar, and they had maple reinforcing hoops. Then they came up with a shell that was maple and poplar with reinforcing hoops that were maple before they came up with the solid maple shell. Well, John Bonham played that middle era, which they called the 50s shell, which was maple and poplar and reinforcing hoops that were maple, and they had what they call baseball bat edges, very rounded. So it adds a little bit more overtones to the drum set because there's more head to wood contact. So the drums are liver. And I really explored that video and discovered the magic formula of tuning. The bottom head's about a minor third higher than the top. Now, for those of you that don't really understand intervals, this is kind of important that you do. I mean, when you listen to any music, the guitarists are always tuning. They got an easy gig. They just have specific notes. They got actually a digital tuner. They press a button. They don't even have to use their ear anymore. They can just use the note, the little digital device. There is a device like that called the TuneBot for drumming. There's actually the drum dial, and there's tension drum keys. None of those really work for me in the end because I have to hear if the drum sounds good. They're good if you're trying to develop your ear, but if you have a piano around, and there's actually apps you can download to iPads and phones that show a keyboard, you can literally start to kind of learn some of these intervals. As a college student, I had to go through music theory, and you did ear training, and you learned all your intervals, so you were able to tune drums. So that's the tuning I use for my kind of studio fusion kit. It brings the sound kind of back at you. Bottom head's lower. You tune the top head for pitch and the bottom head for resonant is a general approach to tuning that I was taught by my college drum teacher, John Mowat. And it really made sense later. I used to tune really low. I was always into this low tuning. And the problem when I tune really low is that if I played the drum quietly, it would sound like I'm hitting like a shower curtain, as John Good would say, just too flappy of plastic. And unless I really hammered the drum, I couldn't get any tone. Now what I've discovered is that I want to be able to tune the drum where I play it quietly and it has a nice sound, and then it just gets louder with the same quality of sound. So I'm tuning higher these days. My top tom on my fusion kit's probably around an F sharp, and then I go in fourths below that between the toms. The reason for that is that when you play multiple tom hits together, I actually play the 10 and 12, or I use a 15 and an 18 floor tom, and I play the 12 and 15 or the 18 and 15. Whatever combination of drums that I play together, I want the harmony between the two toms to sound good. So if you've ever heard like weird intervals on a piano where you play two notes that sound clashy, that's what we don't want. And I used to not be mindful of that. I would tune each tom to where it sounded good, but then when I started playing combinations of toms, they were sometimes in weird intervals. So getting a little familiar with your ear and developing intervals is really good. You can use devices to kind of get you started, but ultimately you're actually wanting it to sound good to your ear. So in the end, your ear always knows, and it's always the final judge as to how you're eventually going to tune. I will say this, tuning requires a lot of practice, almost as much practice as many aspects of playing, to be quite honest with you. If you really are serious about getting an awesome drum sound, it really does make a difference to have a very nicely developed drum set. But for the most part, the principles are always the same. You got two heads. You might have 5, 6, 8, 10 tension rods per head. You want to try to get the head in tune with itself. Same thing with the bottom. I usually set a tom on a drum stool and muffle the head that I'm not trying to listen to so I can be clear about that. And then I turn it on its side, and then I tap both heads, isolating the one at a time to hear the interval to make sure I got a nice interval. I've even tried doing that with my bass drum, where the resonant head is a minor third higher than the batter head, just like the toms, with 2 full heads, and I use a little bit of the Remo adjustable muffle system, kind of based on a Simon Phillips rolled up towel concept. And it just touches both heads, the beater head and the resonant head. So the drum has a tone to it. Not a huge fan of sticking a big bunch of pills in there. The pre-muffled heads are okay, but they tend to just color the sound too much. So when I play quietly, it's not quite as clear. So I tend to go for more ambassador weight heads, both top and bottom. I really prefer the coated sound. I've tried tons. It's really personal preference. A thicker 2-ply head is going to produce more attack and less resonance than a thinner single-ply head. The coating tends to bring out a little more attack than the clear head to my ear because it's almost like sandpaper, a little click to it. So all these little things really do kind of add up, and it's a lot of experimentation, a lot of practice. I can remember times getting just so pissed off because I would spend all this time tuning, and then the drums didn't sound as good when I got done, even with new heads. And you just have to keep going, keep on keeping on, trying to figure out how to get better at it as you go. Now I've gotten a lot smarter, so when I get my drums, I know how to get them tuned up really well, and I can do this over a Skype or FaceTime lesson really easy, which is super cool, because when students would come to my studio, I couldn't tune their drums unless they brought the whole kit. Now I can help them in their environment also with their setup, with ergonomics, because there's a lot of aspects to drum setup that many developing players don't really get, you know, in terms of ergonomics and function and all those things. So with the tuning, it's just been really great. So now what I do is I take my cell phone and I start playing the tom and get a recording, go around the edges quietly, and then get the fundamental note. And then I can take the drum head off, put the new head back on, and there's a lot of aspects to seating the head, which I'm not going in those details. These are more details that I'll have to share with you in a private conversation. I'm giving you an overview of some concepts here, but that way I don't lose where the original sound was. So then I'm able to quickly get my drum back up to where it is. So this is a lot of information about tuning, I know, and there's a lot of cool things about it. So I'm going to look over here at the chat and see if we got any questions here. doesn't look like there is any specific questions, just a few comments, which I appreciate those of you that are tuning into this. So if you want to get more detailed information on this, or if you want me to hear your drums and give you some more specific ideas on that, please private message me so I can kind of get in contact with you and we can go over the details of tuning. The main thing is you just have to experiment. You have to practice. I've detuned drums and then retuned them again. And so if you really get into this and watch some of the videos that are on the internet, I've studied a ton of them, tech videos, talked to sound technicians, had conversations with John Good, watched him tune drums, watched a ton of people tune drums. And so if you keep going, you'll finally understand it, but I certainly can save you a whole lot of time. So let me know if I can be of help. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be back on this Facebook Live on Monday at 2:15 p.m. And on Monday, I'm going to talk about bass drum pedals and pedal technique. So there's been a lot of discussion in the group about bass drum pedals, and I'll discuss a little bit about single and double pedal playing and share with you some of my insights that I've learned over the years and post a little educational information at the end of the video. Otherwise, hang in there, keep on tuning, keep on improving your drumming, and I'll see you guys in the very near future. Okay? Good luck with your drumming. Thanks.